Before we get to today's video, I just have a quick announcement. This video was made as the first to a series on the most well-known tanks of the First World War. If you would like to see the other two videos on the Mark IV and A7V, they will be releasing exclusively to the Armchair Historian website next month. I would highly recommend checking it out. Apart from Griffin's and my videos, you can find more history-related content made by such creators as Alternate History Hub, Emperor Tigerstar, and Potential History, just to name a few. In all, there are about 24 dedicated history creators featured on this site. If you go to thearmchairhistorian.com using the link below and use the code WARTIME at checkout, you will get an additional month completely free of charge on top of your 30-day trial. Now, back to the video. In order to understand the origins of the FT-17, which is widely considered to be the first truly modern tank, we must first understand the doctrine of armored warfare as it existed in 1915 when tanks first appeared on the battlefield. The earliest tanks were limited by low speed and maneuverability, and their main strength was considered to be their ability to act as mobile cover which flattened barbed wire and other obstacles, clearing a path for the infantry advancing behind them. Because of this, the tanks of the time often resembled bunkers with large guns and relatively thick armor. Although these features enabled them to be successful in trench warfare, they were confined by their size and clumsiness to open ground, which limited their applications. The origins of the FT-17 date back to December of 1915 when French Colonel Jean-Baptiste Eugène Estienne began the process of creating a new tank for the French army. To aid in this process, Colonel Estienne turned to the famous French auto industry magnate Louis Renault to design a tank, who declined because of his inexperience with tracked vehicle design. Despite turning this initial opportunity down, the prospect of designing tanks intrigued Renault, and not much time would pass before he began experimenting with various designs in his mind. 7 months after the original meeting, Colonel Estienne again invited Renault to work on tanks for the French war effort. This time, Renault accepted. In the initial phase of design, Renault still lacked a final version of what his new tank would be like. While he more than likely flirted with the idea of a heavy tank which would resemble those used by the British and would fit the doctrinal role of a tank as a piece of mobile cover, he calculated that the engines of the time would not be powerful enough to propel a tank heavier than 7 tons across the uneven terrain of no man's land. In order to address the issue of weight, Renault decided that armament would have to be sacrificed. However, he partially compensated for this loss of firepower by adding a rotating turret to his design, which would cover more angles that would have otherwise required extra guns. Renault now had a general idea of what features his design would include, but he still needed to start drafting blueprints. To assist in this, he brought his industrial designer, Rudolf Ernst-Metzmaier. Together, the design they settled upon was a 7-ton light tank armed with a single 7.92mm Hotchkiss machine gun mounted on a fully rotating turret and crewed by 2 men, a driver and a commander. The driver sat in front of the vehicle while the commander sat behind him in the turret. The tank would be powered by a rear-oriented 39 horsepower 4-cylinder engine, which allowed it to reach nauseating speeds of over 8 kilometers an hour, or 5 miles an hour. The design also included 2 massive idler wheels in the front. While their size made them look a little ridiculous, they enabled the tank to drive over trenches and rough terrain. To keep the tank from flipping over when climbing over steep obstacles, an angled sled was added to the rear of the tank. One drawback of the design was that the crew could not communicate with each other vocally, which would be a problem when the tank was in battle. As a result, a system was created where the commander would kick the driver in different areas of his body to let him know where he wanted to go, something I'm sure the driver was not too fond of. Despite the modernity of Renault's design, which had been designated the Renault FT and only later would be known as the FT-17, the tank was, at first, not considered a suitable option by the French High Command. They considered the tank too lightly armed to remain effective in battle and too small and cramped to mount larger armaments. It should be noted that at this point in the war, France's military had subscribed to the heavy tank doctrine, mainly due to the success the British had with their heavy tanks. After the military had rejected it, Renault submitted his design over to the French government but would struggle to have it approved. Even with Colonel Estienne vouching for the FT-17, Renault would have to compete with other tank designs. While Renault attempted to have his design approved, he continued to attempt to improve it. He would focus primarily on addressing the firepower issue, managing to upgrade the machine gun to a 37mm cannon. In December of 1916, he would finally receive approval to begin production of his tank, but within a few months, this approval was retracted due to the production of artillery tractors taking priority. Up until this point, only a prototype had been made, which would be used to test the vehicle at Renault's Boulogne-Billancourt factory. During this time, the tank's design would continue to be reworked, with the most notable product of this endeavor being the redesign of the tank's cast turret. In fact, during this period, the focus would shift from the improvement of the tank's performance to the improvement of its production efficiency. The downside of this drive for efficiency was the loss of mechanical robustness, which manifested through issues such as sensitive radiator fan belts and a subpar fuel filter. Because of these problems, it is estimated that around 10% of the FT-17s that were in service were out of commission due to the scarcity of replacement parts. Renault would get his final approval in April of 1917 in the form of a large government order. Only 2 months later, the order would be increased, and Renault soon found himself in need to produce around 3,500 FT-17s. Since his factory was incapable of producing an order of this size, anything he couldn't produce himself was subcontracted to a number of other French companies. Additional production licensing was given out to the Americans once they entered the war, and they would go on to create their own modified version of the FT-17, which they called the light tank M1917. Unfortunately, the American modifications to the vehicle would result in only 10 M1917s reaching France before the conclusion of the First World War. The two main variants of the FT-17 that were produced were male and female. Like other systems of tank classification at that time, female tanks were armed with a machine gun, while their male counterparts were armed with a 37mm cannon. The other two variants of note were the Renault Télégraphie sans fil, or the TSF, which was a radio tank designed to function as a command vehicle, and the FT-75BS, which was an assault tank equipped with a larger 75mm gun designed to deal with heavy fortifications, neither of which were produced in significant numbers. As production of the FT-17 had begun, a number of issues would quickly become apparent. Shortages of critical components of the vehicle, mainly stemming from production delays, would result in only 84 FT-17s being produced by the end of 1917. Despite this poor initial start, production soon began to drastically intensify, and by the end of 1918, around 2,700 had been produced. Deliveries of the FT-17 to active units would begin in February of 1918, and on May the 31st of that year, the FT-17 would begin its trial by fire by engaging the German army at Forêt de Retz. The 30 tanks performed exceptionally well in their debut, with its small size allowing it to move through the dense forest, a feat that could not be replicated by the larger heavy tanks. As more tanks were delivered, France's armored warfare doctrine was refined. The FT-17 was now to be used en masse, with male variants leading the formations to break through fortifications, while their female counterparts followed and helped the infantry mop up. As the German spring offensive stalled and the Allied 100-day offensive took place, the FT-17 truly cemented itself as a crucial tool for the success of numerous French offensives. Its massive success during 1918 resulted in the planned offensives in January and February of 1919, utilizing a large number of FT-17s to overwhelm the Germans. Of course, Germany surrendered in November of 1918, meaning these offensives would never take place. The most problematic feature of the FT-17 was its design. This, combined with a shortage of parts, would often result in FT-17s breaking down and remaining unrepaired. On top of this, the hasty production of the vehicle, especially early on, would result in a large number of defective tanks. In fact, a third of the tanks produced for the French government's original order had to be returned to the factories that produced them to fix defects that were discovered upon delivery. Due to the success of the tank and the surplus France found itself with following the conclusion of the war, FT-17s were exported to foreign countries. Suddenly, the tank could be found in the armies of over 20 nations. Between the World Wars, the FT-17 participated in the Russian Civil War, the Polish-Soviet War, the Spanish Civil War, and a number of other conflicts all over the globe. The wide exportation of the FT-17 would also result in America, Italy, Japan, and the Soviet Union all basing their early tank designs on the FT-17. By 1939, the FT-17 had been rendered utterly obsolete by the newer models of tanks that had been developed in the interwar period. Despite this, they still saw action, primarily with the French army before its collapse. The only reason France was still using these tanks was a result of their late rearmament, with the tanks being modernized, redesigned, and redistributed among the French army to provide additional reinforcements to the Maginot Line. After the fall of France, Germany redeployed many French tanks for their own purposes. Some FT-17s found themselves remaining in France and being used by Germany during their occupation. Many of the FT-17s would end up in the hands of Vichy France, and when the Allies landed in North Africa during Operation Torch, the FT-17s would once again see combat. Predictably, the FT-17 proved no match against modern tanks like the M4 Sherman. The last time an FT-17 variant would see combat was during the 1948 Arab-Israel War. However, there are some reports that they were used by the Mujahideen during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It should be noted that by this point, they had been relegated to the role of static emplacements, such as pillboxes. One must admit, however, that a theoretical confrontation between a Soviet T-62 and the 70-year-old FT-17 would have been a pretty interesting scenario. For what it's worth, the FT-17 was an excellent tank which was far ahead of its time. It also ushered in a new doctrine of warfare, that of mobility and concentrated firepower, that proved highly successful in both world wars. Even in spite of its significant oversights and design failures, especially early on in its service record, it will be remembered for the rest of history as the common ancestor to all modern tanks.